So, we have an exciting guest for you this afternoon. Our guest needs no introduction, for she is known around the world. She graduated from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She went on to complete postgraduate studies at the University of Maryland, Harvard, and Boston University. Later, she became Assistant Dean at the Boston University School of Medicine and Chief Medical Officer at DC General Hospital. She is also a homeopath, nutritionist, and enjoys energy medicine. Her expertise in water has led her around the world, exploring the use of water in Europe, Africa, Polynesia, the Caribbean, and the Orient. As a member of the prestigious Functional Water Society of North America, she has presented papers in Japan on water to over 2,000 scientists. She's on a number of health advisory boards, and yet, in spite of her busy schedule, she still finds time to help her patients understand the importance of water to their health and be here with you this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Mona Harrison.
There's a lot of information that we're going to try to cover in a short period of time today, and to try to keep me organized so that we can get the most bang out of the buck. I will refer to some of my notes, but again, welcome. And to begin with, as we look at water, one of the features that I'm not sure you've ever reflected upon seriously is the fact that water is critical to every element of life. There's nothing on this planet, in fact in this universe, that does not depend on water. Today we're going to direct our activities to how, in particular, water has an impact on our bodies as humans, and perhaps to begin to evaluate it as a healthy thing that is more than just some clear liquid that is convenient and you get a thirst for, but that it has some activity. And in fact, the word bioavailability, or water that's available to you as a living entity, is the approach that we're going to take today. Now, if we start off and get a sense of what are these differences in water, and what's in my water? I mean, to most of this audience, you at least have some elementary knowledge of water, but we're going to just start from the beginning and say, in many of the towns, including this one, but more appropriately across the United States, things are added to the water to attempt to clean it. And so for most of this century, what has happened is that they had begun to add chlorine to the water. Now, for many of you, you say, so what's wrong with that? In fact, I have a swimming pool, and I have chlorine in my swimming pool, and I take a shower every day. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, we're here in the United States, and we have excellent water. And of course, the government wouldn't bother us here in terms of putting something in the water that might be injurious. I say to you that this has not been a conscious attempt to make you sick or to have an impact on your cells. The problem we're faced with today is that the government doesn't know what else to use. So even as we back up for just a minute and look at these pristine rivers and streams that we have in this region, and in the Pacific Northwest, we get a lot of rain, so there is a lot of water around. And we look at the beautiful Columbia River Basin and say, but of course we have good water here, and we have pristine rivers, and we have a beautiful mountain here that gives off a lot of water, that supplies a lot of the area. But how many of you remember about a year and a half ago, it wasn't that big in the news, but there were reports about a science class. This was a group of high school kids that decided to look at the rivers and streams as part of their science project. And in the course of that, they started running across all these little frogs with deformities. They saw so many that everybody got excited about it, and it became a national issue, to the point that what they were seeing, if you can imagine, were frogs with 3 eyes and 7 legs and 2 extra organs and things missing. And you can say, so, okay, that's a frog. Wait a minute, what significance does that have to me? Number one, we found them in our little rivers and streams here in the Pacific Northwest. They also found them in the Thousand Lakes in Minnesota, which are coming off of supposedly some pretty pristine waters over the Canadian border. These were in areas where we thought at least they would have clean water. I mean, if I had to pick a state like perhaps New Jersey, where it's been noted that the water has been bad for years, or the District of Columbia, where they don't know what in the devil they're going to do with the water there, or areas which are heavily populated, you know, we would perhaps think that maybe I'd have a little dirty water there. But even there, people don't realize just how bad their drinking water is. When I've spoken to people from the Department of Energy, one of whom I know rather closely, and when she came to visit out here, she came with her bottle of water. And I said, well, you don't need to bring bottled water. This was a couple years ago. You don't need to bring bottled water out here. We have excellent water. She says, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. Anywhere we travel in the United States, we take our bottled water. He says, are you aware that in the state of South Carolina, right at the Georgia border, that the water almost lights up and irradiates when, if you were to put something that would allow the radiation to show? Do you realize that here in Washington State you have the largest Superfund in the United States in terms of cleaning up the water, the groundwater, as secondary to Hansford, and what took place there in the building of nuclear submarines and for a nuclear power plant? In fact, if we back up just a minute, we find that there is, since 1995, and I don't watch that much TV, but on occasion something says turn the set on, and I walked into my house one day in 1995, July of 1995, it says turn the TV on. And just at that moment, the Center for Communicable Diseases was making an announcement that I just happened to hear. It was only on for one day, so they had done their public duty to announce to the public what they wanted to say. And in that broadcast, they noted that there was no safe drinking water left in the United States. Now, people begin to say, well, I have a well, and I have excellent water because I don't have chlorine and fluoride in my water. Wrong. Most of the tributaries of the Columbia are in trouble. And if the frogs aren't news enough to you that there's a problem, I tell you, take another look. Now, when we look at those frogs, again, why are these frogs so important? If you begin to go into the coal mines around the world and they're worried about noxious gases or toxic gases being eliminated, the old rule was to send in a canary. The canary didn't come out. The canary died. You knew you didn't go in. Well, the frogs are comparable to those canaries when we speak of the water system. They're that sensitive to critical changes in the water, enough to say to you, don't go into the water or don't drink that water. Our water is bad. And not to scare you and not to send you into a depression about it, if I said to you that the United States did not have enough money to meet the needs to change the water system, the onus then comes on us in individual families to decide what am I going to do for my family? What am I going to do to make sure that my water is tolerable? When I think of little babies, and I know that these babies are totally dependent upon what I feed them and what I give them to drink for their life. And if you come from that perspective, you get a sense of the responsibility you have for your family in terms of knowing and understanding what's in your water and what you can do about it. Now, we've created a pretty grim picture here, but to say that there are things that can change your water and make it more healthy, make it so that your body can absorb it and use it and help you to become healthy, that's what we're about today. So let's take a closer look at this chlorine that we mentioned here. And many of you were around during the First World War. And do you remember the use of gas masks by the troops in Europe with the First World War? That was to prevent the chlorine gas that was used in an attempt to use biological warfare with the troops during the First World War. It was chlorine gas they used. Well, guess what, folks? That same chlorine gas is generated every time you take a shower. And in fact, you inhale more chlorine taking a shower than you do even drinking 8 glasses of it a day. Probably haven't thought about that and its impacts on your lungs. Nevertheless, getting into a swimming pool and swimming in chlorine, you absorb through your skin, the largest organ in your body, chlorine. Things you probably never even reflected on. Well, when I put that chlorine with a body, and let's take a vegetarian to begin with, and say, well, I only eat vegetables. I can't imagine anything toxic would interfere with my body. Well, when vegetables decay in the body and they mix with chlorine, they turn into another compound. And the one that they turn into is trihalomethane. And you can say, okay, so what's trihalomethane? How many of you take your clothes to the cleaners to get them clean? You have the occasion to go to the cleaners, okay? Well, the cleaning fluid that they use to clean your clothes is trihalomethane. So you can imagine that what you're introducing to your body is trihalomethane, or cleaning fluid. Terrible thought. The cancerous effects of trihalomethane have been very well documented. And you say, well, I don't understand. Why would they do this? Well, let's take another example, because you're not vegetarian. So we'll make you a meat eater. And you say, well, I don't have any problems with that. Wrong. That decaying meat stuff in your bowel, for all of you that have one bowel movement a week or one bowel movement every other day, turns into a fine paste in the digestive tract. And that paste deposits along the blood vessels and stiffens or hardens the blood vessels. So instead of being flexible pipes, we've now got these hard steel-type pipes within our system. And you wonder about where your high blood pressure came from. You wonder about hardening of the arteries and what's going on in your heart. Let's try a little chlorine in your system in terms of not being able to utilize or move out some of the things in your bowels. You know, the old middle-aged spread that guys take for granted is something that's supposed to happen. Wrong. A lot of that, the hardening that's going on there, is because of the elements that are in water itself. Then we add, what else do we have there? Well, the government has already decided that it can't use chlorine. I mean, they can't add any more chlorine to the water. They recognize that there are a lot of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that they would like to kill. But if they add more chlorine, they know that they're stepping into some very toxic levels. So what are they adding additionally to make things more, or to make them more safe so that they're not as dangerous from an infectious disease perspective? Guess what they're adding, folks? Mercury. Now, for all of you that know about the old amalgam scenario in terms of not having amalgam in your teeth and how it reacts with the body, you know the toxic nature of mercury being in the system. And guess what else? They're not required to tell you that they have mercury in the water. The laws are written so they only have to tell you about chlorine. They don't have to tell you about mercury. In Michigan, in Washington State, and Washington, D.C., mercury is added to the water systems. So you get an idea that perhaps it's not the safest thing in the world to be drinking at a time when I'm saying to you, drink more water. In fact, that's what got me into this in the first place. You know, I got across to my patients that, yes, you should drink more water. And then they turned back to me and said, okay, doc, what water are we going to drink? And I got stumped. And it really has taken me around the world to try to find some of the best waters and the best things to use in your water that will help you have safe and clean water. Now, what about the old fluoride scare? What in the dickens is going on with fluoride? There have been debates back and forth. There have been blow-ups in different legislatures as to whether or not fluoride should be used. The study that originally talked about fluoride came about during the 1930s, and it was done at the Carnegie Mellon Institute. Now, Carnegie Mellon happens to be one of the biggest benefactors of the aluminum industry, with Alcoa Aluminum. The aluminum industry has a problem. They don't know what to do with the byproducts of making aluminum. And in fact, around any aluminum plant, you'll find there's no vegetation for miles. And any animals that happen to be grazing in farms or whatever near an aluminum plant, you'll find dies and ages very fast. Well, the same thing happens to you if you're exposed to fluoride. Your body will age doubly fast. So a 30-year-old will look like they're 60 years old. And in areas of the world where fluoride is naturally, these people do age very, very fast. In addition to that, going back to that study which says we should add fluoride to the water because it will prevent tooth decay in children. Wrong. When they tried to repeat that study, and that study was done by a benefactor of the aluminum industry at Carnegie Mellon, when they tried to repeat that study, they found it was not correct. And in fact, it caused further decay of the teeth. In other words, it enhanced decay of the teeth rather than preventing decays. I don't know if you're aware, but fluoride is the chemical that's used, that's injected into zoo animals and the bulls and the bullfighting rings of Spain to keep them docile. In Russia, while the Iron Curtain was still down, I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but they added fluoride to the drinking water of all the prisoners to keep them under control. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why fluoride perhaps is being added to our drinking water, but it's there. Lead, I think many of you are familiar with the toxicity of lead. In many of the older cities, the pipes were all made out of lead. Or where the pipes are joined together, lead was used by the plumbers to keep leaks. The soldering of the pipes in the middle, lead was used. Now, lead has been known for years in terms of its toxicity to the brain. It goes directly to the brain and can be a cause for death. Now, many of these elements are very, very toxic, and the people that absorb them the most are fast-growing tissue, which would be our children. So that often we see the toxicity in the children with many of these heavy metals and the gases. So you want to be aware of that. In fact, there was just a year ago an announcement in the Seattle system of the worry about lead in its water systems. It's very high in a number of the old houses in Seattle. There are a number of old houses here in this area. So don't think you're out of it just simply because you don't live in a big city. Many of the old farmhouses still have lead as the basic pipes that they use, the old galvanized pipes, or the solder used in the pipes are made of lead. So you may want to, take note of that. Now, I thought that we'd move from there, and let me just say, we're in a world where the word filter versus purification system, as we move into this new century, are the terms that we're switching from. To the American public, first question they usually ask is, what kind of filter is this? And they've gotten pretty used to looking at carbon filters and looking at water conditioners and things being added to the water, okay? That's old technology. That's the technology of the 70s and the 80s. Yes, charcoal type filters will take out odors, will take out smells, will take out basically gas types of materials and their smell from the water. But that's all they do. You want to know about what things will actually convert the water into a drinkable or to a live thing that you can absorb into the body. About 25 years ago, and through this community, we had people very much interested in BEV water. And what did BEV water mean? BEV stands for Bioelectric Vincent, standing for Dr. Vincent's name out of France. He decided to come up with a standard that could be used for measuring how toxic water was. And so things were divided into what we call BEV units. Yes. In that, he used distilled water as the basic water to measure all waters by. And it's simply a standard that says if I have a particular BEV number of units and that water is pure, that water is clean, it is drinkable. Reverse osmosis here, which we have on the screen, to give you an example of things that are looked at, pH and resistance or RH factor. And again, as it is gauged against distilled water. Reverse osmosis is a good way of purifying your water. The only problem we have with reverse osmosis is that it takes everything out of the water. And what's left after reverse osmosis is what we call in the water industry dead water. It does nothing, it gives nothing back to the body. So that we've got a water that's clean, but it's just sort of sitting there. It will not interact with your cells. As you can see, and this is in BEV units with reverse osmosis, the pH usually will range anywhere from 5.3 to 6.8. The RH factor is 25 to 29. We'll come back to the electrolysis portion of this, but electrolysis being a process that is used to clean up water, you can see the difference here in terms of the RH factor and the pH. It's almost 3,000-fold stronger than with a reverse osmosis unit. Now I bring up reverse osmosis because the government is recommending to you that you use RO water, RO standing for reverse osmosis, or boil your water. Now here's the problem with boiling. When you boil your water, all you're doing, well, you will hit organisms that die at high temperatures. And I put it that way because with some of the mutations and some of the bacteria, viruses, and fungi, they're developing skins that are so hard that boiling the water doesn't even touch them. So that's one thing. Number two, like we talked about the trihalomethanes, gases like that get concentrated when you boil them. So in fact, as well as some of those heavy metals. So all you're doing is concentrating them, and they're all in the bottom of your bottom of your pot or whatever it is that you boiled with. So that doesn't work. But that's what the government to date has recommended to folks to do. Boil your water. No good. Okay. As we move from that into the next spectrum of things, and we start going into what other things do we need to look at in the water, let's take a look at pH, which was one of those items on that list in terms of looking at purity. Now here in this area, and I have this beautiful chart behind me because many of you have probably seen it and not paid too much attention to it. This is a chart that reflects the aquifer here in this region. Now, what is an aquifer? That's a particular bowl, we'll use that term, that all the groundwater seeps into. So this particular aquifer is a very large one. And the bowl is very large, and all of your water comes from that aquifer. Now, this is a very peculiar aquifer in that it's the type of aquifer that whatever's on the surface gets into the groundwater or gets into that bowl. So whether I'm over in Tumwater or I'm here in Yelm, anything on the surface, so somebody pours oil down a drain here or in Lacey, it's going to get into that bowl and be a factor that we draw our water from. Now, all the pink areas up there are areas that are in trouble. This aquifer is in trouble as it relates to acidity, as it relates to what's on the surface getting into the bottom. This is from the state. This chart was given out by the state officials. When I started asking questions about, I said to them, I'm probably the only one in this entire region that tests their water 2 or 3 times a day. Why is our water having a pH below 7.0? And 7.0 is where it's a neutral point. It's where you want to have your drinking water, to at least be at 7.0. And in testing, we were getting anywhere from 6.3 to 7.3. And I wanted to know, why is our water so acid there? They couldn't answer me. They still don't know. But it's a problem. If I look at pH on another perspective, how much acid is in the water, and I go to Long Island, New York, I find just the opposite. There we have pHs at 8.5, 8.0. And I said, wow, okay, so is this going to be great water here? What's going on? You know, it's very interesting to me. I just call them coinkydinks. That I just happened to be in the right places at the right time. And the Sunday while I was there, the newspaper in New York just happened to run an article on the groundwater on Long Island. And the Brookhaven Institute is located, has been based there for over 45 years in Long Island. And the problem is they had been dumping some of their chemicals into the ground. And the groundwater was contaminated. Contaminated so badly that the government had, of course, taken measures by putting lime into the water to try to get the pH up. And so the pH standardly was 8.5. But I knew from some of the patients that I had there that, as an example, we had kids with cleft palates in one square block. I'm sorry, correct on that. In one hospital, within a 1-year period, 11 children were born with cleft palate. Now, the chances of that happening by accident are like 1 in a million are the normal numbers for that. 11 children in one hospital, all coming from the same geographical area, had cleft palate. Goes even further. In one block, within 1 year, 11 women had breast cancer. All, again, on Long Island. I say there's something wrong here. Just your good old common sense tells you there's something common here that's factoring in. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But you can see that being too acidic and being too alkaline can have its problems. So you don't necessarily want to do that. In Arizona and New Mexico right now, they have the problem of too much alkalinity. In fact, their water's starting at 7.8 and going up. And people are having problems from too much alkalinity in their water. So this is a vast country here. Waters will vary in different regions, and that needs to be kept in mind. Now, I put up here this equation called the equation of life, because this is an equation that was rediscovered by Dr. Carey Reams shortly after the turn of the century. Now, equation of life, because this holds for humans, it holds for plants, and it holds for animals. This is a basic equation of life. If the soil is too acid, if the soil is too alkaline, disease will enter the plants grown in that soil, or they will be weak. If things are balanced, you'll get a tremendous yield, and again, the plants will be strong. The same thing happens with animals. Their pH. As long as they fall along this equation, they will be free of disease. And you'll note there that we are looking at the pH of the urine and the pH of the saliva, which is reflective of the buildup in the body, how we break down our foodstuffs and how we take these foodstuffs and try to make them incorporate them into our bodies. So pH ideally should be 6.4 in both of those elements in order for the body to be diseased. Now, it doesn't rely totally on pH, because as you look at glucose here, it's also how the body handles carbohydrates, how it handles mineral salts, and also when I look at nitrates and ammonia, how we break down flesh protein, which would be meat, seafood, and poultry, and on the nitrate side, and as we look at ammonia, how we handle vegetable protein. Next slide, please. Now, as we look at this and showing you the significance of that, we find that in this narrow pH of 6.4, we absorb all the minerals. And as we move away from that pH of 6.4, we find that there are certain minerals we can't absorb. So as an example, if we look at the next slide, but note before we change that, it's a little bit difficult to see from a different distance, that we're at both ends of the spectrum here. If you're too acid, you don't absorb them, but also if you're too alkaline, you can't absorb them. Okay, you'll note there that at a pH of 5.8 is where we begin to absorb calcium. So that if your body does not have a pH, meaning your urine and saliva does not have a pH of at least 5.8, you can't absorb calcium. And as we go on today, we'll let you figure out the significance of being able to absorb that calcium. But if I look at manganese, which you can absorb until you have a pH of 6.0, if you look at eggs and sperm, there's no egg or sperm that will develop, whether it's in a peach or whether it's in you, if you do not have sufficient quantities of manganese in the body. Well, you can't even absorb manganese until you have a pH of at least 6.0. So we wonder about the number of infertile young women and men we have out there anxiously trying to have children and having difficulty producing viable eggs and sperm. Many of them are too acidic and cannot absorb enough manganese to even produce sperm and eggs that would be viable. Then you add to that what we said earlier in terms of the frogs. If the frog eggs and sperm are bringing up mutations and defects, what do you think is going to happen to your sperm and your eggs if you're drinking the same water? You get an idea that water isn't just a casual little thing here that you can see through when you hold up a glass. There's got to be more to it than that. Okay, now, you say to me, Doc, when I look at these minerals here, what significance is that? So I can't absorb, above the sperm and the egg situation, or I can't absorb calcium. What else does it mean? We can go on to the next slide with the tube. If I cannot absorb my minerals, I like to put the minerals or make them tantamount to air in an inner tube. If I can't get enough air, if I can't get enough minerals to a particular organ, then I'm going to suddenly get this little outpouching on the side of the organ. Now in a human body or in an animal, that would be tantamount to a cyst. This little outpouch on the side of the inner tube. I keep going along. This lasts for, say, a year. Now I've got a permanent outpouching on the side of that inner tube, on the side of that organ. That would be tantamount to a tumor. And all of that is because I can't get sufficient minerals to those organs. The one we can see, the biggest organ we got is our skin. So you start seeing cysts and things on your skin, imagine what the other organs look like. And each organ has a different percentage of minerals that it needs in order for it to grow or to be, in peak performance. So let's say the brain says, well, I like a lot of calcium and I like a little potassium, and let's see, throw in a little magnesium. That I need to just have my brain function. And if not, I'm going to begin to develop cysts in my brain. Or my thyroid, hey, it needs calcium, it needs potassium too. But it needs it in different percentages than my brain does. And every organ in the body has its own percentage there in terms of what it needs and whether or not these little outpouchings will begin. These cysts, these tumors will begin. Now, if this goes along long enough, or the mix has been strong enough, I might find that I can't get any air at all. I can't get any minerals at all to those organs. That's when we call, it would be comparable to a flat tire. That tire's not going to roll at all. That would be called, in energy circles, a delta cell. Another term for that would be a free radical. All that's when an organ cannot get the minerals that it needs and the energy given off of those minerals. You can take the next slide. The other term that we use for delta cell or free radical would be cancer cell. Now, how many of you have seen, if I add water to some metal, or leave it outdoors for a while and it hasn't been appropriately coated, it begins to do what? It begins to rust, okay? Rust is the same as a free radical. It's the same as decay. It's the same as the word oxidation or oxidant. The metal is oxidizing just by adding water to it. It is not getting what it needs. Something has to counteract that. So for purposes today, we're going to look at rust on metal as you rusting on the inside or your organs decaying. Basically, again, why did that happen? Because we couldn't get the appropriate minerals to them. So then you say, okay, I'm beginning to put two and two together here, but how do I do that? And what prevents me from doing that? Well, if I think for a moment and had to pick an organ in the body that was the most important organ, can you guess what that organ might be besides the brain? We'll take the brain as number one. But what other organ do you think? Heart's an important organ, but believe it or not, I could still have cells going, even if the heart slows down. I mean, there are other ways to keep the chemical and the cells vibrating, okay? I think I heard it over here. Give me another guess. What other organ?
Liver.
Skin is the biggest organ we got, so it tells you what's going on in all those other organs because we can see it, okay? The liver. The liver is your workhorse. Everything filters through the liver, okay? We tend to think, and if you could find that slide on the digestive tract behind spiny, we tend to look at the digestive tract, I think, a little erroneously. And one way that we look at it is we think that everything goes through your liver, through your pancreas, through your gallbladder, etc. Guys, the digestive tract is one long tube, open on either end, here and the anus on the other end, okay? And so what starts here in your eating goes through this long tube, 30 feet of it, and comes out on the other end. Food going through. Now, in the process of going down that tube, different things are added in. And particularly in the stomach is the machine that breaks it down so that the juices from that can enter your bloodstream. And it's through the blood that things are taken to the liver. And from there, things are dispersed throughout the body. So that you can imagine, just for a moment, that the liver is the thing that's going to determine where everything gets distributed, including how much potassium do I have to send up to the thyroid? How much calcium do I have to send to the teeth? If not enough is coming to that liver, or if the liver is jammed with a lot of toxic material, then it can't do its job. So it'll be working, let's say, at 50% performance. So I can't manufacture and distribute everything that I need. I only can send 50% of it. That's when those organs begin to die. So if the liver is overloaded with toxins, it can't do its job. So I'm very interested in something that will affect the liver, that will allow it to be cleaned out if necessary, and will strengthen it so that it can do its job. Now, Dr. Kerry Reams, I mentioned earlier in reference to the pH chart and the equation of life, and he's one of the few scientists in the world. He lived about the time that Einstein and Edison and all those beautiful physicists, he was also a biophysicist, where Einstein worked with E equals mc squared, Reams worked with mc squared equals E, or can I turn material into energy? And they respected each other. He tested 280,000 foodstuffs for the spin of their electron. And if you can imagine for a minute that's the impact of that. If I have electrons all spinning in this direction, okay, and all of a sudden I have another one going in the opposite direction, where these things overlap, there's resistance. Go either way you want. I got resistance because of this overlap. That resistance I want, and there's been quite a bit of controversy out there about food combinations or whatever. Well, I can't eat that, because if I eat that, it'll cause a lot of energy to be given off, and there'll be a lot of resistance, and I don't want that. Guys, you want just the opposite. You do want that resistance, because that resistance is the energy that you live off of. So if we've got a whole slew of electrons going this way, and all of a sudden I add one foodstuff out of those 280,000 foods that spun in the other direction, the electrons spun in the other direction, I think many of you can guess, but guess what that foodstuff was? The lemon. Its electrons spin just the opposite from all the other foodstuffs. And it creates that overlap, that resistance, so that that energy is what, we live off of. Now, I think it's very interesting, and, nature makes no accidents. If you look at the lemon, what does it look like? It looks like the sun. Nice, bright yellow, very powerful fruit. In fact, it's been very fashionable to add lemon to your water in many restaurants. I'm sure they have no idea what they're doing, but it's the best thing in the world they could add. Now, when we start talking about current and electricity in the body, Edison discovered direct current. In other words, things going in one direction, the way most of those electrons spin. Tesla came along, looked up at the sun and said, I've got to figure out the way the sun does it. And the way the sun does it is the way adding lemon to your water does it. It causes things to spin in two directions. Now all of a sudden I have what we call alternating current. And we find that it takes less energy to get to an end point. Where direct current, I might be able to light up the town of Yelm. With alternating current, the same amount, I could light up the entire eastern Washington state. You get a sense of I'm much more efficient with alternating energy, so that I would want my liver to be operating like an alternating energy thing, more so than I would want it to act like direct current or an inefficient direct current type of energy. Well, when I add that lemon to your water, your liver just loves it. And in fact, Dr. Reams also found that the liver is loaded with the kind of hydrogen that's given off by the lemon. And these are what we call negatively charged hydrogens, H with a minus to it. That particular hydrogen allows the liver to work at peak performance. And from infancy, roughly to 5 years of age, your liver is loaded with these negatively charged hydrogens. You're born with them. So it wants to keep it at that level. So anything that you can give back to the body that will allow those negatively charged hydrogens to be in big numbers would allow that liver to work at peak performance. So we can begin, and I've probably been responsible for lemon prices being as high as they have over the last couple of years, just simply by this and lecturing in several cities. But we can start with just simply having lemon juice in terms of that. And all of, or most of the waters that we're going to talk about today all deal with adding negatively charged hydrogens to the liver, so that it allows the livers to be cleaned up and allows them to work at peak performance. Now, for a moment, I'm going to have you reflect on being a big battery, or your brain being a big battery. And some of you will say, really? Yes, you're a big battery. In fact, you're nothing but a big ball of energy, period. But we'll save that for another discussion. And on each of these topics, we could probably lecture for an hour on each. But because of timing, let's see if we can piece them all together here. The brain is nothing but a big battery. And if I were to ask you, if your battery went dead in your car, what would be the first thing you'd check to see whether or not there was something wrong with your battery? You want to know if there was enough water in your battery, or there was enough acid, meaning the plates were working okay, so you had enough acid to it. So guess what, folks? What does your brain take to be sure that the electricity is flowing appropriately in you? It takes water and it takes acid. Same scenario. Now, our brains are roughly 90% water. Now, there are some situations where the percentage of water in the brain can get as high as 99%, and that would be ideal. But I'll say that most folks on the earth are functioning with water at 90%. That would be the ideal for them. Many of you are functioning with water levels around 70%. If your skin is dry, which again is the largest organ you have, if you're beginning to get wrinkles, then you recognize that there's not enough water in your body. Because wrinkles, again, that's the organ you can see. And it is reflecting to you what the rest of your organs look like. In fact, let me just take a moment here and say that through the studies that have been done, we know that at age 40, you have routinely 45% less water than you had when you were 5 years of age. We're really at the place that we're talking about, you don't age, you dry up. And I want you to reflect on that a minute. By age 70, you have half of that amount of water in your body that you had at age 40. Now, one of the strongest arguments I've seen for not being overweight is what happens in obesity in age and water. Being obese at age 40, you have 63% less water in your body than someone else who's not obese. If you're 70 years old and are still obese, you'll find that you have 63% cut that 45%, cut that in half. So you have half the amount of water in your system that a normal 70-year-old would have. So good arguments, folks, for keeping those cells nice and wet. Good arguments for letting things happen. Now, as we look at this, and an important scenario here is as I look at the different addictions that we have up here, and for those of you having difficulty seeing this, on one side we have salt, caffeine, nicotine, and cocaine. On the other side we have sugar, alcohol, tranquilizers, marijuana, and heroin. Now, I've grouped these together because they have different effects on the body and on the brain. On the salt cocaine side, there's a tendency to use those things to try to speed the brain up. It's like they're stuck in quicksand. They need a jump start. And all of those items act like something that the brain makes naturally, which is tryptophan, which is the body's natural painkiller. So these are people that are holding on to things, trying to get rid of them, having pain inside, and thus the tryptophan type of things, salt all the way to caffeine, sort of give them a jump start. So you can think of the number of people that have to have their 5 cups of coffee a day. Salt is added like crazy to their system. They're holding on to stuff, okay? On the other side of the equation, we've got people craving sugar. And, you know, I don't put any judgments on these things because it's just as hard to come off of sugar as it is to come off of heroin. These things tend to slow the brain down so that they can function. And you will often find individuals on that side of the equation whose brains feel like they're running the 100-yard dash every day. These things try to slow them down a bit so that they can think and they can function. Now, I've gone here because, again, you can see the importance of that battery operating appropriately. If you were to ask any of these persons, any person addicted to any of these things, how much water they drink, unless they've seen me already, most of them will tell you they hate water. If they get 1 good glass in a day, it's a miracle. And in fact, if you were to talk to heroin addicts, and this came from some studies I did at Hopkins around 1990, with heroin addicts and cocaine addicts that had been addicts for over 20-some years. They had survived the system that long, but they've been around for a while. And if you ask them how much water they drank, they tell you they hate water. One of the things we learned from turning around these particular folks so that they had no longer withdrawal symptoms and in fact could get off the drugs was simply getting them to drink water. And we did a simple thing with them. I did a simple thing with the patients that I was involved with, and I gave them an option. I said, if I could get you so that you were no longer addicted to the drug that you're addicted to, you had no withdrawal symptoms, would you be interested? 1/3 said no, I like the drug, I really don't want to stop. The other third said, I don't believe it can happen, so I'm not interested. And the other third said yes. And within a couple of months, we got all of those people so that they were no longer chemically addicted to the drug that they were on, just by getting them to drink water. Now, another interesting thing, and a reason I pulled this up also, is that we find the individuals on that sugar side, heroin side, alcohol side, have a tendency to have very fast-moving brains. Their brains are processing information so fast that they tend to go to these things to try to get a common denominator here so that they can function, so they can think. So they had a tendency to be pulled to these things just to slow their brains down. And in fact, when we did a survey of the prison system in Maryland, we found that 65% of the individuals in the Maryland Penitentiary for that year were all dyslexic or had attention deficit disorder. I hate that term. I don't like the disorder part of it because there are geniuses sitting in prisons. There are geniuses often addicted to a number of these things because their brains are processing information so fast. The deficit is in us with not knowing how we're going to teach them. But if I've got a fast-moving brain, I need jet fuel to keep up with that brain. And if we can jump ahead to the periodic table for just a minute, and we're going to take a break in about 5 minutes here. But if I were to look at this chemical periodic table, and I look smack dab in the middle of that table, and for purposes here, I'm going to look here at titanium, I'm going to look at platinum, PT and titanium. And in the middle of this, I have some very unstable elements, particularly rubidium and iridium I'm going to point to for just a minute, but just to show you that those things fall smack dab in the middle of the periodic table. And for most chemists and physicists, we really don't know what those elements are about. We know that when energy, particularly heat, is given to those elements, they begin to process very, very fast. In the last 3 years, because we didn't have the equipment before this to be able to detect this, we found that in human brains, they're loaded with iridium and rhodium. In fact, the younger the individual is, the more iridium and rhodium there is in their brain. Now, we haven't done the study to take our fast-moving attention deficit disorder individuals or dyslexics and look at their brain. But I would suspect very strongly that they're loaded with iridium and rhodium. The babies have a lot of iridium and rhodium in their brain, but what do you have to do the first couple of years of life? You've got to learn everything about your environment, how to walk, how to talk, how to read, how to do all of those things. And in the National Education Association statistics, they find that from infancy to 5 years of age, your learning curve goes like this. At 5 years of age, something happens, and for the rest of your life, it goes down. What do we have happening at 5 years of age? They all go to school and get processed out of them. They would continue to learn at the rapid pace that they did. We also find in those 5 years of age, you're introduced to a lot of foodstuffs and different toxins. So again, your learning curve begins to go down. I'm going to stop here because it's a good natural break. This has been just a general base for you to build upon. Now let's look at what we can do, understanding that this is the way the body works. And if I introduce high-frequency waters to my system, or bioavailable waters, what happens to them and why? So we'll take a break now, and there are refreshments in the back for you. Thank you. Now, there's been a lot of confusion these days, in particular, just because there's so many water products on the market. And people just don't have a ruler to sort of use to gauge, well, what is this one about, and what do I use this one for? And can I use them all? You know, where do I place these things, you know, in the order of things? So I've tried to look at common denominators and not so common denominators in each of the things that many of you are familiar with, just to give you some guidance going through this maze. When I begin to look at things, I'd start off by just saying that all of the bioavailable waters cluster, all water clusters. And in fact, here's the other one. Yeah. Clustering is just a natural occurrence in nature, and if we look at the grapes there for a minute, we can look at the grape clusters for a minute and then come back to that one. Just this cluster of grapes, if I could have you keep that picture in your mind, in the back of your minds, and get an idea that this is a naturally occurring shape of a group of elements. And many, many things repeat that shape in the body that are good for you, including water. Water itself, when the molecules come together, actually look like a cluster of grapes. And many of you are aware that we're finding out in the medical literature these days just the importance of the grape as an antioxidant for treating cancer and for treating heart disease. So again, there are no accidents in nature, and if we study nature, we'll have the clues to everything we need to make these bodies work. In fact, you're just smaller representations of the larger part of the earth. So if things work in a larger picture, they also work for you. You're just a small example of a whole planet. And so if you can imagine that clustered things in a cluster that grow in a cluster or form that way are some of the best things for you, that'll get us started. Now, if we go to the next slide in terms of cluster size. Regular tap water itself, as you can see from this, forms in a cluster of roughly what we would say 13 to 15 grapes, or 13 to 15 little spheres within its cluster. And the size of the cluster does make a difference in terms of how it responds in the body. So you'll note that tap water is at the top here, and mineral water here, by that we mean the routine mineral water that you could get bottled from just about anywhere these days. And I would have you to begin to read the labels on your water bottles. Now, up until October of this year, there was not, which hasn't occurred yet, there has not been a demand that the FDA has given to the manufacturer. Prior to this, no one was required to put on their labels everything that was in their water or to put the water source. It was only a year ago that they even had to put on the label what was in the water. As of October of this year, all the government sources will be required to tell the public what is in their water. So that's going to be an interesting occurrence coming up in a couple of months. Now, in the bottling industry, still, they have not been required